Good. So, good evening, everyone. Yesterday was, I think, the decade that was assigned to that day. The 90s were much more thoroughly followed, and I think that's an indication of perhaps the importance that that decade seems to have in more and more discourses and sort of like research plans and in the imagination of different people working in different contexts. We can discuss more tomorrow, I think, about why that is and why the 1990s seems to be this common denominator for different contexts. But today we'll focus on the 2000s, a decade that was present in everyone's presentation, but was also absent, or it was introduced through references to other decades or centuries. And I think that's probably something relevant for our discussion, which is to say, was that a transition? Was that a transition between a particular formation and a particular way of looking at things in the 1990s and the current, let's say, post-2008 condition? So I think this is something that we can come back to perhaps in the conversation. But I want to start with like a directed question to Pili about a topic that was only briefly mentioned in his talk, that of ink art, of modern ink art and its resurgence in artistic practice, in the market, in institutional strategies. And I want to particularly ask him, how does that relate to the current ideological direction of the Chinese government, and to put it particularly in the context of the discussion that and the different elements that you brought in your talk.
I think the whole ink art issue become extremely interesting in the last decade. And there are two, I think to answer your question very short, that for sure the government try to use the ink art as kind of not as the media, but more as in the symbolic way to represent this kind of the nationalistic, which they can challenge something they so-called universal values, or this kind of so-called the westernized contemporary art. So that's always the way. Even in the recent Xi Jinping's talk about the art and the literature, he paid a lot of the attention on this kind of ink art. But ink art is also this kind of the official language to be a major point of the propaganda. But what the ink art they talk about is very different from this we so-called the ink art in the traditional context. The ink art they talk about is more like this kind of the new ink art after 1949, which already been informed by this kind of the westernized style or this kind of the realism style. So that's quite the interesting part. But the ink art become market-wise, the ink art is also kind of like the hatch part to the crash of the the went down of the contemporary art market since the 2008. If you see the market-wise, that I find it always quite interesting that the auction house and the commercial gallery are more active on promote the whole idea of the new ink art than the curatorial scenario. So because as the contemporary art sometimes has been regarded as kind of the politically unsafe. So the ink art of them with more abstraction, more kind of the new literary, they can play relatively a safe role. So that's kind of the interesting situation. But all this kind of, even the nationalism, the nationalistic symbolic way, or the commercial driving the new ink art phenomena, which covered this kind of complication of the ink art. Actually, from my point of view, the ink art was very interesting, and especially if you think of why and how the ink art became this kind of the very important field for Chinese contemporary art. Think about that in even 1989 when Yang Jiechang participated the Magician of the Land. He already tried the 1,000 years of the 1,000 layer of the ink as the way. So I think the ink art in the 90s, they already have been regarded as kind of the a way to identify Chinese artists themselves. But more interesting than that, as our recent research in M+, we also put the ink art as a very important category for us. But what we are trying to do, like we even have a gallery we are served for the ink art. But what we try to do, like we more regard the ink art as like kind of a transnational, international concept. In China, when you talk about the ink art, we talk about the Song Dynasty, the Yuan Dynasty. But thinking about that, there's still ink art in Korea. There's still modern calligraphy in Japan, which is very close to abstraction. So how can we generalize all these kinds of things? So that's quite an interesting part. Yeah.
Yes, and I would also like to ask you as well, because we discussed also in the break a little bit also about Roger's presentation. I think would be interesting not to necessarily open all the implications of this discussion, but to respond to Roger's first proposition about the West, simply because there are two very different semantic categories of how each of you referred to, to two concepts of the West, and I think it would be interesting if you could respond from the perspective of your talk, which was looking at it more as a kind of intellectual formation.
Personally, I really enjoy Roger's presentation. It's very enlightening for me, and but still, I think this kind of we have two. I talk about the Western in my presentation as well, and also about the globalization. And yesterday, Fabi talked about the globalization, and also this mainlandization, 大陆化. So for me, it's like that's very interesting culture experience, as I have worked in Hong Kong for 4 years. And for me, the Western is there. The Western is still the Western. The Western, even I know there was huge difference between American, French, and France and England. But still, I think the Western is there. When you see the whole refugees, you can see very clear border of the Western there. And even more than that, I think the Western is always the Western or the mainland. Somehow there always is kind of the projection from the vulnerable group, from the people when they are weak. Western is a concept projected by the East people, as the mainland is a kind of concept projected by the non-mainland people. I extremely feel that, well, I'm in Hong Kong because I have never seen about the mainlander as kind of like such like a powerful and political concept. Even I feel more that in Hong Kong. So I think that's layer one. But the other things I want to have more remarks on that. I heard from the Fabi's talk. That's like I also want to remark something about kind of the mainlandization and the globalization. So my experience here, I just start talking to Uta. I just feel like sometimes the mainlandization is a part of a globalization. I think I just invented we just talked about the word. It's not a one nation, two system. It's like one system, two nations here. So I think that this whole thing, not about Hong Kong, think about Korea, think about Japan, the whole new the right wing, and think about now in Europe and even American. So that's quite an interesting concept for me. Thanks.
Roger, would you like to answer to that? If not, I have another question for you.
No, there's not much to answer. I mean, I try to abscond from those generalizations because they don't get us anywhere. So when I mean, this is of course all true, and we can easily agree, but then what? Huh? But I just wanted to point out that for a Westerner, if you believe me to be one, I mean, this whole construct, or you call it projection, I mean, this is a term I'm quite comfortable with, is much more febrile. I mean, the English call it the English garden, but this is Chinese, right? So this is what I want to point at. I mean, that there is a history of entanglements, of deep entanglements, and cross-fertilizations buried in the notion of the West that needs to be unearthed and acknowledged.
Yes, well, I would, yeah, I think it's, well, maybe, yeah, we leave this discussion here because it's, you know, it's a question of semantics that, you know, would take hours and hours to just agree on the common use of the same semantic principle. So it would be like a long diplomatic negotiation. But I wanted to ask you, Roger, if you can, you know, briefly talk a little bit for the audience about how your understanding of migration of forms has changed from the initial proposition when you started working on Documenta 12 throughout the process and in the past 9 years since the exhibition opened and closed.
It developed through the collaboration with artists and with researchers. So and I'm happy, I mean, to acknowledge, I mean, two of them who are here. I mean, Daisy Bizenix and Royce Eng. They form a group, a couple group, called Zhang Mala, and they did a kind of exhibition research thing in this venue for which I'm responsible now, the Johann Jacobs Museum in Zurich. By looking, I mean, this was a commission into the low end of global trade between Africa and China. And they collaborated with a Somali asylum seeker in the Chungking mansions in Hong Kong. And first, I mean, it was a kind of ethnographic study about the way African traders come to Hong Kong, bring stuff, take some stuff back. So this whole dynamics of a global economy that is not necessarily visible, but all the more vital. And at some point, I mean, he asked them for help because his bank account was closed. And then as artists, ethnographers, whatever, they had to decide to abandon the project or to get even more involved, because he asked them to act basically as front people of his non-existing company. And so they continued with him a trade that then became an exhibition. And they found a marvelous way, I mean, to reveal this complexity, which I can only hint at, in a sort of exhibition that was part, a presentation of a real trade transaction and also part of a prose poem that took some distance, I mean, from the kind of writing we tend to encounter in art institutions. So in other words, to me, it feels that the principle is expandable. It is fruitful. I mean, at least from me, but it always needs to be driven into empirical realities. I mean, to make sense formally, because it could also invite a kind of dandyish self-indulgence, I mean, to discover, I mean, all those formal connectednesses that are quite pleasurable. But this kind of narcissistic infatuation would be the death, of course, of the migration of form as a living principle, and also as many people's undesired for life reality.
Thank you. I would like to pose a question to Joanna and to Russell, sort of as a common question, but hopefully this will also like trigger an exchange between the two of them, because there's similarities between your situations. You both work in leading positions in two institutions that are each some of the most some of the largest museums in what is commonly understood to be a specific region. And you have different, I guess, strategies of relating to that region also because the implications of your respective regions are different. To be more precise, the National Gallery of Singapore, where Russell is a senior curator, which is mandated or is a state institution of a country that sees itself very much as a leading cultural hub of a region that it designates quite clearly, Southeast Asia, and that is very eager to define and control, I guess, well, I mean it milder than that. This being at least the sort of like the position of the Singapore government, and in the case of Joanna, running one of the most important museums of modern and contemporary art in Eastern Europe, a region that was also very much defined, and it has perhaps more solid basis in recent history for its existence, but it's a term, and it's a region that nobody wants to claim and to control and to possess anymore. So it would be interesting to hear from both of you. Also, well, maybe a little bit from the perspective of institutional dimensions, because the National Gallery just opened very successfully in less than half a year ago, and the museum in Poland is still awaiting its permanent building, but it's also, I guess, very relevant for the Hong Kong audiences, considering that it's quite similar to the situation of M+, the museum in Hong Kong, that also has an extensive collection and a program, and also like a physical presence in temporary spaces, but it's awaiting its permanent building.
The National Gallery of Singapore opened 6 months ago, and it's inherited, in a sense, a collection from the Singapore Art Museum. So it's part of a kind of trajectory of institutions in Singapore that's developed over 20 years now. And as I was sort of trying to grapple with in my talk, I see the position of Singapore has shifted from trying to project itself outwards internationally and to make itself a hub and bring people in. It's now trying to project out and use Southeast Asia, I think, as a platform for that. Obviously, it's so small, it can't really do it on its own. And there's been obviously a very determined government policy to encourage that, and that's really firmed up, I think, but along very particular diplomatic lines. I mean, the ASEAN definition of Southeast Asia rather than a more fluid one that could include Taiwan, could include Hong Kong even. And of course, the Chinese and Indian populations there are so strong. I mean, the gallery itself, internally, we're obviously very aware of that and want to open that up. And I guess we're just, at the moment, working with what we've got in terms of a collection. And it's really the first time that a Southeast Asian permanent collection has been put together and displayed historically. So in a sense, we're starting from the basics and trying to establish a history and trying to establish a framework for these discussions to start. And I think you need to sort of bed things down before you can take it to the next step. So I think it's still very, very new, and it's very exciting, I think, to be able to be part of that and to sort of see that. And we're trying to be very reflexive about it as well. I mean, we're not seeing that as a fixed narrative. And it's something that needs to be contested and challenged as well.
Well, so our situation cannot be more different. So we are definitely not representing any region and even not a nation. Definitely not a nation. And now we are probably a tiny minority again, like it was in the 90s. But the power is like always in a very complex structure, and Poland, luckily enough, it's quite built on quite a complicated system, and the local governments are still active, and this is the one political dimension, and the other dimension is that it's a lot of institution, organization, initiative, and the scene is very active. So even if one disappears, there will be not a major catastrophe. And I guess as a structure, we are able to survive all those constant changes. As an institution, obviously, we also don't have a fixed narration. We are facing in the last, we're existing since 8 years, such a major changes, new challenges, and so on, that one of our policies is to keep open and try to adapt. We also cannot represent anything in terms of collection. If someone would like, but I don't know whether that would be a reason for that, to have a collection of Eastern European art, I have to say I don't see any reason for that, but the collection is there are two collections, major collections. One is in Ljubljana and one is in Vienna. And I doubt someone can collect now major pieces of Eastern European artists in one collection. That would be enormous financial effort. So I think that our task is rather radically reformulate what we imagine as a museum. We are sometimes much more similar to the culture house, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to keep a quality of searching for the new forms of making exhibition or collecting or display or all other forms. And I think another difference is that Warsaw is a very homogeneous place. We have very tiny minorities, and that's also a difference. And mostly Vietnamese, which is now disappearing, and Ukrainian, and that's a very homogeneous place, and that's make everything completely different. We still have to work again like it was in the 90s, and it was gone for a moment with this old notion of identity, I hope in a new way. But and definitely I hope that it will become interesting, but of course we are doing a huge step back, and it's good to be conscious of that. So that's maybe enough for that answer.
I guess the other thing I just wanted to add is that the gallery has a fairly specific remit in terms of the history that we deal with. So it's really looking at the modern, what we've sort of defined as the modern period. So in a sense, it's kind of fixed dates. So the contemporary is fairly marginal in terms of what we're doing, so that the kind of what's going on now is difficult to represent, I guess, in the institution at the moment, but it's something we're wanting to address. So in a sense, it's looking at the 19th and 20th centuries, what's already happened, and how to think about that, and how to think about modernity in Southeast Asia, which of course happened at different times in different ways. But it's a very fruitful way to think about, obviously, where we are now. Yeah.
So I think, well, before we open to the audience, I think it would be interesting to see if anyone would like to pick up on, looking at this decade as perhaps a decade in transition. If you feel that the 2000s is operatively not even helpful to define a phenomenon itself, as the 90s might very well be, or the post-2008 era might very well be. I mean, again, acknowledging that, this is obviously pure convention, but still one that could work operatively. And is this the case that the 2000s are simply a moment of transition, or would you rather consider it helpful in any way for any kind of like intellectual, for a starting point for a conversation?
Yeah, I think in the Hong Kong context, definitely I would say like the year 2000, yes, it's transitional because we could see that like it evolved like from a very small scenes to, of course, still not so big, but much bigger than before. But I think, as I mentioned, that it was the surge in the early year is now more clear idea that that could be a subjectivity that you can look at, and something like a substance you can call. I mean, either you call it local artists or Hong Kong artists, and that's much more concrete than before, because it was very difficult, and it was always like relying on, okay, the Chinese context or the international context, but that's the difference.
From my point of view, like the 2000 until, as I said in my presentation, until 2008, this period is quite transactional. I mean, like it's a transactional period. But for China, that after 2008, all the problem, all the questions have been jumped out, and the people really have to think similar. So I think the 2000 until 2008 is a very interesting transactional period. You see the final resource of the urbanization. You see the final resource of the new liberalism, where you see it how it collapses. So that's quite interesting.
Well, I guess for Australia, it was to me it was a consolidation of a very conservative turn that happened in the mid-90s. And it was kind of marked by Australia's participation in the war on terror and the way it responded to the refugee crisis. So to me, it really felt like a formation of a particular kind of ideology that's really embedded itself since then. To me, the 80s and 90s were a kind of progressive period that really shifted in about 2001, 2002. So it's, I mean, I think that's had a huge effect on cultural activity, and it's being played out. I mean, it's still being played out.
I would rather perceive 2000s as a continuation of the 90s, and in a sense of development, growth, and so on and so on. But that's might be very local context again. And it ended, they were very long, 2000. They ended very recently for us. And but I guess that 2000 are important because they led us to build a structure, led us to build also in sense of institution, but also intellectual and in relation. And with this capital, we will probably have to survive at least the next decade. So in that sense, 2000s are very important.
Yeah, well, it's somehow, I guess, interesting that everyone chose to answer from the perspective of their own from their own context, and the circumstances that were themselves locally relevant, I think, to a large extent, which is different than yesterday when a certain definition of the 90s referred to what was common and what was shared in the decade, and I guess that's relevant about how these two decades can or cannot.
But it could also be purely accidental.
Well, many decades are just accidents. Forgettable one or tragic ones. Okay, so I think we can open it to the public. I know that there's many people wanting to ask questions and to make comments. Yes.
Hello. Hi. Just reflecting on two things from yesterday and today. One is the relationship between historical method as a method of looking at history and the past, and the question of the curatorial, which has been in debate so much in the recent past. So as I understand, and this might be just my speculation, is that one of the opportunities perhaps the curatorial gives is to look back at in history in extremely different ways. In the sense that, in that way, I would say thinking about the past as decades is otherwise a different version of thinking with historical forms that are already available. And some way the contribution personally for me of the curatorial is to circumvent these ways of looking at the past and then reimagine radically how do you realign temporalities to speak about local histories, global histories, and so on and so forth. That's my first comment/question. And the second one, especially if I were to think about 2000s as such, one of the very important things personally could be the redefinition of what does an institution mean. And perhaps I can go far to say the collapse of the institutions with digital. And yes, we did mention internet in the passing, but I think the radical redefinition of the world that happens today and the possibilities these conversations are happening is because the digital moment happened. And a lot of institutions actually thought they were going to wear out because they could not catch up with the radicalness. Because unlike today, it's more institutionalized, even digital, but when it became as a radical alternative to how information can be processed. So I think for me, I would like to pose the decade of the 2000s is a series of transformations that put together by this technological mass that just makes connections that a lot of institutions cannot, I think, still can't grapple with. Thank you.
Is it directed at anyone in particular, or you would like to pose it generally?
I can try to answer the first part. I think it's difficult to talk about pastness at all. I mean, if you look at something that is supposedly from the past, I mean, like one of those examples I showed, like tiles from, I don't know, 15th century Persia, and you're in front of it, then it's probably not relevant if it's past or not. On the other hand, what those processes of accelerated capital accumulation do or effect is a sort of relativization of local legacies. And the only way to escape this immanence, which is, I think, one of the big problems of the contemporary art world. I mean, that you start to feel suffocating. One way out of it is to find access to the pre-modern, but without getting into this conventional art historical mode. I mean, without identifying things or classifying them or categorizing them. So not from the perspective of the antiquarian, but to look for something like a spiritual value that might contradict contemporary realities. I think this is very important, or this is an important way to work, because it also helps you to get rid of many of those really silly dichotomies. I mean, that structure our experience, like between art and non-art, and craft and fine art and so on and so forth.
Digital radicalization.
Please.
I will try. So you are absolutely right. That's change that might change traditional institution. For the moment, I guess it changed institution itself. For instance, there are tons of examples, but for instance, in our case, we don't have, for instance, to acquire archives. We only digitalize them and make them accessible. And then the growth of accessibility to the all kind of materials, rare items, and so on and so on. The growth is amazing in that sense, and that also changed the institution, that we are not container for objects so much like it used to be in the past. But this is only one level, the level of communication with the public and so on and so on. And and of course there are also institutions already without the material articulation at all. But for the reason which that would be too long to explain, I didn't. I perceive it. I perceive it still as a rather different form, different tool than real radical change. But maybe it's coming, or maybe simply I don't see it.
Other questions? Lisa first, and then Sophia, and then yeah. So. Well, I'm just, the order of who raised the hand, so you were first.
Actually, I want to hear some comments on this recent phenomena of the rise, or rather influx of new Chinese museums, like a lot. Because when I heard about it in the presentation of Russell, about there was a figure of 1,500 as far as I remember. I was very shocked, even though I wasn't unfamiliar with this way of narrating from the country where I'm from. And I want to hear some comments contextualizing this, the rise of China and the global art wars, which is basically three things for me. First of all, globalization, but globalization under this power relation, the realities of power relation that we still live in, especially when Pili mentioned in his presentation about like how contemporary Chinese art are constantly seeking approval from the outside world. And secondly, the kind of phenomena Russell discussed with this transformation of China, of regionalization, looking more not in the global world, but really looking at the region. And third, localization, when different museums start to say, we need a museum because we need to look at our own art. Can I just have some comments about this phenomena that I don't really understand?
There's a lot of parts to that. Yeah, I mean, certainly that number of museums was, I mean, Roger's working with one now, but would know more about it. But they're of all kinds. I mean, it's just a figure really. But I mean, there's state museums, there's private museums, there's very, very regional museums of very specific things. But I think this idea of the museum, I mean, it's interesting, the previous question or comment about digitization being the kind of devolving of institutions, but they're proliferating more than ever. So there's still a desire for the encounter with the object and that experience within the museum. I mean, I think from a Western museum, in terms of Chinese museums, it's complicated, because there's certain expectations about museum practice that needs to be met, and in China some museums are, some are not, and it's quite difficult to negotiate or engage at times in terms of just basic things like loans or museum standard kind of atmospheric conditions and all of that kind of stuff. So the movement of objects becomes a real issue, and I think there was an interesting article by the director of the Reina Sofia recently about the idea of art objects and this new law about the movement of art objects, and it's really a nationalist kind of turn in terms of who owns what. And I think that this turn to the local has an interesting relationship to that. It's like, you know, who owns these materials, and is it to be, you know, accumulated like your museum in London, you know, just this stuff, this amassing of stuff. How is it shared? And I don't know, I'm just kind of riffing on that, but there's so many different aspects to that I think are really being played out in very interesting ways in different locations.
I mean, it's quite clear that what is at stake for a country like China. I mean, to do this, and this has, on the one hand, or what's fascinating about it is that it's clearly a claim to a past or to a cultural legacy that is necessary, I mean, in order to legitimize, I mean, the regional hegemony. So this is one aspect. But on the other hand, this cultural heritage is largely feudal. So then how to access, I mean, this feudal legacy from the perspective of a post-communist capitalist, or however this subject position could be called, and there's clearly no way. So, and I'm talking out of an experience. I mean, not just as an observer, but as someone who is so far involved with setting up an institution or an exhibition institution in Suzhou, in this old cultural and commercial capital of Ming Dynasty, China. So I think that precisely having, I mean, the institution as a kind of void where certain methodologies that might stem from the West cannot be properly applied, because it's simply this interface on which the classical museum model is based does not exist, also gives you some freedom, I mean, when it comes to experiment with actually how people interact with things. Because what you have also in encyclopedic museum is, I mean, in New York or London, is that you have people passing through the galleries, right? I mean, without any kind of interaction. So there's probably a possibility for developing, I mean, new ways of looking at things.
Very short adding to your question that I do agree with Roger, but I also want to add in some practical part that if you're thinking about the history of the private museum in China in the last 20 years, they got really fast. I mean, the first private museum happened in China in the later 90s. Mainly, they happened in bookshop. Happened in the real estate. Same like Japan in 70s, the first private museum all happened in the department store in Cebu. Now it's already in the phase 2, the phase 3. The phase 2 was the kind of the enterprise. We also called the private museum, like OCAT, like this kind of the real estate company support museum. Now we call it generation 3. That's more like a private collector want to extend their collection to the same room, like a Sifang, like a Long Museum. So I think two issues here. On one hand, I totally agree. I want to see this issue from a very positive way because they may generate more understanding or more possibility for the museumology trying. And also, I just give one quite interesting example that Chinese private museum in China can learn very fast. I mean, the last year, the Youth Museum in Shanghai, they installed a huge installation called the Rain Room. There are 3 months of that. Surprisingly, a department store just totally copied that work, and for free. And 2 months later, Youth Museum had another show, Giacometti show. And then the same department store have another show for the Picasso show. Basically, just all the Picasso prints. But for the normal audience, they don't care if they see the real Picasso or even the Picasso prints. And they even be more appreciated if they can shoot in the photo freely. So this makes all the museums thinking about what they can offer more besides of the just show the art. So they are really digging their heads thinking about the education. So I just want to show in a very short period on the practical level, they could learn very fast. Thanks.
Sophia?
I actually think that Pili responded to some of one aspect of the question that I wanted just by giving this example. And just as a preface, because I do think that it's related to mass culture and mass media and the place that artists has, and I think it's actually connected as well to the Powell Athamor controversy around a monument that is unmonumental, meaning a common man that probably any other place would be called a bum, no, that gets to be represented. And of course, people don't like it. They want someone that is so-called productive. So my thinking around the fiction of the West, and it's also very funny to me that we're talking about the West because generally I'm in conferences that they talk about the South. There's the cardinal points are the North and South, not the East and West. And it's actually not a question around Occidental thought versus Oriental thought. I think that the concept of the West is neither a fiction either. It's a very specific geopolitical regard that has to do with access and mainstreams, meaning it has to do with market. For people to talk about globalization, I mean, there are all these euphemisms. It's not even ideology. Communism, capitalism, that's a thing of the past. That existed. And we could refer to it back again through artwork by making a historical materialist approach to it. But ultimately, the conversations around the West today have to do with access to the mainstream, as it pertains to art, as it pertains to artists being part of collections, being part of the art histories that people will study in schools, reproducing systems of ideology. My thinking is that very much, as in the conclusion of Russell, and also with a bit of skepticism so that it doesn't really close down entirely, but I do think that there's a reconsideration of one's own region rather than an internationalism as a form of resistance to a specific notion of the market or of market acceptance. And that can prove to become a resistance that becomes in provincialism, see? And that I think that the politics of resistance is to be able to negotiate with points of access and closure, but insofar as that it could defend the rights of citizens. I think that in not the rights or the market prices of artworks. I mean, in the end, the art market as it stands in the millions of dollars and so on is point apart, right? So going back to the conversation yesterday that was not about artists that had dropped out, but artists that had withdrawn from the art circuit and entered, using the same aesthetic strategies, but entered into a larger field of production of meaning, not of market, which was through television and through newspapers, I think associates back to the Powell Alzheimer unmonumental statue, made of rubber of all material, meaning of something flexible, of something that is that could actually be poked, and it's not made of bronze, it's not made of those materials. So I just think that that the West is a fiction insofar as it could be used as a euphemism, not to talk about the problems of inaccessibility, not about access to the mainstream, but the inaccessibility precisely that the refugees experience, or the inaccessibility that is being stated precisely because of the difference of religion, let alone class. And I think that those are the things that the conversations that tend to go into the geopolitical arena avoid really addressing. So whether it's Muslims or Confucius or other forms of religion, that is what happens. 2001, with the September 11 attacks, did create a new world order. And it created it based on, it did define to a large extent a decade of insecurity, not only of transition of the trade agreements that had been signed the decade previous all over the world. But I do think that the decade, the first aughts, presented a series of issues that in the art world, they were not really addressed fully or wholly. And they weren't addressed because we didn't know what to do with it. I do think that the state of exception that was presented, not only as a philosophical arena, but as an actual political state in which many countries were there, created also a state of incognito, of pause. And I don't think it's a coincidence that during that decade emerges or strengthens, I would say, a practice around archiving, a practice that we could see eventually falls into a curatorial paradigm of doing our own art history, of collecting archives, as we just heard, or whether we didn't do it, of digitizing and so on. Meaning I do think that the so-called archive fever, first named by Derrida, we know the Oqui and Wisser exhibition, and I do think that the Peter Osborne picks that up to define our state today. Precisely that decade of not knowing, of that exception on a political status, was a decade that presented us with a reconsideration of what is going on in the world. I do think that the market is so strong right now that it makes us forget. And we think that globalization is based on visibility and access to the mainstream rather than on the very subject matter that is being addressed by these works. I mean, Pili, the work that you showed us, it's all referencing back the mass media or academic, quote unquote, academic art into new forms of, into new ways of painting the same things. And I think that mediatization is only possible because of the state of terror and the state of exception and the unknowing that first decade of the aughts presented. So ultimately, yes, the West is a fiction insofar it becomes a euphemism or a distraction for us to concentrate on a geopolitics and an access in and out of markets, globalization call it, not to call it later accelerated capitalism, versus to talk about the ideologies at present or at hand that have to do with religious belief systems that also make us understand less the presence of China in Latin America in terms of extractivism. I mean, we're not talking about, the major problems right now, all these things that relate to the economy and petroleum and global capital in that sense, they have nothing to do with the arts. For that system, art is just an asset. It's better than real estate. So in this context, where art, I think, has to do with disruption, with like stepping out of the mass media to be able to provide other languages, I do think that there's a lot to address with the works, precisely with the works that were presented, with the rubber sculpt statue, a rubber statue. Incredible, no? This type of works, and my only comment there is the fear I find, and I think that it's naturally provoked by the possible provincialism that could be caused by kind of, localizing one's activity within, again, a geopolitical zone. rather than a much more transversal system that is not defined by kilometers or by radius. No.
Thank you. Would anyone want to comment, or then? Well, no, because then the microphone is there, and then we can move to you. Please.
First of all, thank you. Second, this is posed to everybody, or some of you guys, whoever wants to respond. I wanted to go back to the idea of categories, or labels, or buzzwords that came up in a lot of the talks that you guys gave. They can either be given by curators to artists, or they can be, as Lauren talked about, given or self-given by artists in terms of Chinese artists or local artists or Hong Kong artists. So there are obvious limitations to using categories, but there are also advantages sometimes, or at least practical reasons to use categories. So I am curious about your thought process or decision process when you think about categories, either as a curator or writer, as an artist. How do you make those concessions? Do you even think about it at all? Or do you just kind of like give in to using categories and hope that people know that there are limitations?
No, you're unfair. I mean, we did the seminar, I mean, a couple of days ago on those questions, and it cannot be answered easily, or like this, or at least not from my part. But what needs to be done, and this is what one of you brought up, I mean, with the many voices, is, I mean, those constructs, I mean, they have to be solid, but then they also will be provisional, right? And this is something that needs to be shown. I mean, that they have those two sides. But how you arrive there, I mean, through what kind of processes, I mean, I have no recommendation to make, but I think our kind of work always involves this also it's also a sort of discipline that you invite people to work against you, basically, in the process.
Thank you. Well, I don't know the answer for that question. Probably it looks like that one is trying to be extremely critical. That's probably the base of the curatorial practice. Whatever category will come up, you are trying to fight against that category as long as possible. So that's why it's usually quite a long process. But that's the only practical remark I can have.
Yeah, I mean, it's a starting point, and it gives you a framework from which to work. And I think you need to be porous and you need to be reflexive. And yeah, like Sophia was saying, I mean, you don't want to be provincial, you don't want to lock it down, you want to be able to keep it open. And I think, I mean, as I was saying before with the National Gallery, I mean, we've had to start with this ASEAN kind of base framework. And I think that's productive in a sense in terms of just setting something out. But there's a real need to keep that discussion open and as a platform to have these debates. And it's the willingness to do that that's really important.
I don't know the answer, to be honest. It's super complicated. Yeah, basically, no, it's a very difficult question. But I want to share you some of my personal experience. I think that none of the people in table can share the experience, because when I entered into Hong Kong, I entered Hong Kong 4 years ago. I have a very strong feeling. I don't know if would I remembered that feeling that this quite like China in 1997, 98, where today I show one picture there when Biennial fake this kind of the documental letters. At that time, as in China, they don't have that many infrastructures. They only can show abroad. So how are people be chosen, be selected? That's the one thing. And the other thing, how they can draw enough attention when they show abroad. So it's more like how they play with their identical things. So sometimes really play with that. But on that level, in the later 1990s in China, we pretty talk about identity things. And also we place us as the victim of the globalization in all the conference, in all the symposium. But my recent feeling in the last 2 years, like as a Chinese creator, I participate in other conversations, even in Hong Kong, even in Japan, we more like people want to globalize some. We more like the victory of the globalize. So I think this kind of identity politics always have to shift the position a little bit. So now I more feel the anxiety, this kind of the identity problem of the Hong Kong is somehow like that feeling 10 years ago when China society first involved this kind of like a globalization, and so that's very weird experience happened in the last 10 years for me personally.
Your questions make it sound bad. I mean, I shouldn't say any categories in the public, but somehow I think this is very relative, because it does give you some sort of like convenience when you try to describe things, and sometimes actually it's just necessary and to avoid confusion. But I think that could be very interesting questions to think, instead of categorizing thing, what is, maybe we can also start to think what is not. So, because you're sitting next to me, I have been really thinking like, what's M+, you know? So, I mean, obviously, you know, people working in M+ would not like to make M+ as a Chinese international museum, right? But it sounds maybe a little bit better if it could be like an international museum in China. And so I think it really depends on the context and how you frame your discussion. There's no definite answer, yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to continue what Sophia mentioned, and also Roger said at one point, there is the moment you try to undo an institution. And I mean, in the 90s, there was still a certain attempt of like with Biennales, and so like to look, is there a different kind of production? Is there a different kind of audience? Or is there a different kind of negotiation where art maybe is one voice of other voices? But now we're really back to institutional building, and I'm just curious. I mean, like, it doesn't matter if it's Poland or China or the West or whatever. Like, why are we back doing this?
We are no back. We never stop, I'm afraid. And in a Polish case, it's simply delay. So this is not a good evidence. But it's also, it's a shift. Institution incorporated all strategies of biennials. I don't mean that all institutions incorporate everything, but all those methods become, maybe via internet or however, available. So institution is now something which has very open formula. But maybe you mean the other thing, building the buildings. This is the other story. No, you mean creating institutions.
I mean, you just mentioned M+, what M+ tries or wants to be, or like if you look Tate Modern is today, it's, and I have to say that like I got trashed before by them saying this, but the institution becomes super institutions, you know, like they do education, they provide PhD stipends, they're doing the collection, they are the alternative space. all in one. You have a queer seminar, you know, it becomes the all-encompassing one place. And I really wonder, and I mean, of course I'm part of that too, but really to come back with Sophia, I also ask myself, what does it substitute for? You know, I mean, there must be a reason why we're doing this and why it stands there and why young people aspire to be part of that. Like in my generation, they try to get as far away from it as possible.
I think that you need a base to protect your research, for example. I mean, this is one thing. And of course, I mean, I understand the reflex that if you're here in an institution, you associate Tate Modern, but you don't have to. Institution can mean many things. I mean, it doesn't have to be this kind of monster. But I think what is important, I mean, if we think about minor institution, let's say, is that people have a chance to come back to it. I think this is important. I mean, this slowing down of perception and providing alternative views of the same thing. Because what is happening, or what I see is happening, that things are permanently being washed over. And this destroys a certain rootedness, by which I don't mean a kind of essential belonging to something, but I think that yeah, I mean, when I had your question before, I mean, I was referring to potential pre-modern resources in cultural legacy. This might be a fiction, I don't know, but in my view, it's a fruitful one. I mean, to try this out. If there's some antidote to to submitting to the dynamics of the now, and I think that this is also what we need. At least I can say this with my age in this contemporary environment, that you need a space where you can put things down and will refine them the next morning. I think this has become a quality.
And also, if you look how the museums appearing, usually it's a rare situation that some power structure is imposing. Maybe the big museums, maybe Tate, can be seen from that perspective, but usually you have first Parasite and then M+. First you have a lot of tiny, small institution, and then the museum. So this is also sort of I know, but what I want to say is that first it starts with this tiny one, which you would not perceive as a scary, but this is starting exactly there. I cannot explain that process precisely now, but we cannot make that omission. That is usually starting from growing, and usually this is some kind of a spontaneous process of growing of the scene.
Well, I think also with, say, the bigger institutions, I mean, it's a self-perpetuating kind of issue in that, especially if they're state-funded, there's all the expectations that it has to more and more give a return on investment. So the institutions have to find ways to attract more people, they have more programming, they expand, they have a nice new building. I mean, and that, you know, starts to suck up what's around it. I mean, it's a sort of a neoliberal kind of outcome or process, which needs to be, yeah, I mean, it needs to be carefully managed, but it's a trajectory that's, I mean, say in somewhere like Singapore, there's never been institutional critique in a real sense, I don't think, in terms of challenging the institution. I mean, there's been small groups doing their own thing, but they always actually worked with institutions. I mean, the Artist Village, most of their projects were in the, you know, university galleries or the National Museum Art Gallery, for example. So there was never really a space outside of the institution. Yeah.
I think that the whole point of or the demand around the responsibility of a curator is precisely to make clear the prerogatives of that representation. So it's not that the state is demanding that wants the blockbuster shows for more audience. They don't know better. See, they just want audiences to be attended precisely because there's an investment of public monies in that. It would be more cachet to have the blockbuster because they would understand. But I would say that ultimately institutions are there to represent people. Whether the director or the curator wishes to represent an artistic community as what represents our times, or if they want to represent their collection, a group of artists or certain issues that have been developed across time, and those are the prerogatives, right? I suppose that the question is, who is building the institutions now? And who are they serving? Not why are we building them?
I still think, I mean, if you say the West is a fiction, I think institutions are a fiction of a history that makes us secure. And while the world is pretty unstable. So I think there is a reason why at this point we are so much looking into the security. I mean, materiality, Roger, is still kind of a reassurance, as you said, like we protect research or we try to go back to something. And I also see this drive that people look for this. So I think we're building actually a fiction.
I think we can, yes, I think we can build pyramids, and I think we can continue the discussion tomorrow in the plenary session. And this leaves me to thank all the participants for the discussion and for their inputs today. So a big round of applause. Applause. Yes.